the build is part of the development cycle of the application. So it does not end when it is executed and we do the testings. There has to be afterwards a deployment of the application in the production service. So now we are going to see some of the improvements of GeneXus 16 in the build process and in the production process deployment. So, firstly, we have for the build a new generation, the .NET Core. It does not replace the one we have now. They're going to continue existing together, but I'll show you some of the features of the new one. Then I'll tell you about the possibility of creating your own log through an API. It's called Log API. Then we are going to see build events. That is to say, we'll be able to execute tasks immediately before or after a build with the possibility of coding these events. And finally, we're going to talk about an API that will allow us to read the configuration of the application under execution through an API. .NET Core is in general the new version of generator that Microsoft has. Maybe one day it will replace the .NET generator, but not yet. It is a multi-platform generator with an open code. That is to say that it's compatible with Windows, Linux, and Mac. It's a generator that serves to generate web and console applications or applications in the server. So it's a quite complete tool. But for the time being, Microsoft had the strategy of having it coexist with the previous one. So in GeneXus, we are going to have the generator .NET at the same time, and both generate C#. So we have now the possibility of generating with just generator. And there in Wiki, you have the link of what can be used. The Log API, so far the user having these properties, the logout in file, etc., was able to set various levels, but the log was always the system. Now with this API, we are going to be able to include our own error messages, that they are included in the log of the system, in the various files of the log in the system, of the log system. We can even categorize these error messages of various sorts. For example, we can create our messages and catalogate them as a fatal, a warning, or info, or debug, and they will be with that category inside the log of the system. In the case of .NET, client.log, and in the case of Java, they are kept in the various log files that has Tomcat that divides the logs in various files. So from our application, we will be able to generate log entries, and we will be able to see them in the log system. And this is valid for web and SD. In the case of Android, we have the tool logcat that allows us to see the logs, and from the Android monitor, it can even be invoked. And in the case in which we are generating iOS, we can see it in the console of debug of the hard disk compilator. We have, with the GeneXus 16, the possibility of doing some tasks before or after the build. It was the case sometimes that we had to copy files or clean a directory or do something simple that we wanted to do before the build or immediately after. Now we can do that by using build events. For this purpose, we use the build menu and the build events, and there we are going to have a menu that has some macro already codified that will allow us to do some basic operations like copying files or editing a directory. So they're available already there. Another thing we find in version 16 is an API that allows us to see the configuration that is being used in the execution of the application. That configuration is normally kept in the webconfig files or Cloud SG or Cloud Service Config, and it was generated by GeneXus, but for some servers or some applications, we used to do something manual with these files, and we executed with one of our versions in these files. But after it was executed, we know very well which were the values that were taking. We had to go back to the files. Now, from the runtime, from the execution, we are going to be able to have access to the values of these files and obtain information about what is effectively the configuration that is being used for the execution. And not only with regard to the standard files, but also with regard to the variables of environments. For example, in a Java environment, you keep certain values, etc. So we will be able to consult those environments to see how our application is running. It's also possible to use other kinds of files and include calls to the API. It has two methods, the hash value and the get value, that allow us to see whether certain parameter in the configuration has been set with the hash value, and with the get value to obtain the value that that parameter has within the files or the environment variables. Now let's see some of the changes with regard to deployment. Basically, three things are available. We will be able to export the reorganization, and there are some improvements with regard to the application deployment tool, which is the one we use in order to deploy those things that come from the three last upgrades, and also some changes in the cloud deployment services with regard mainly to the F6.
As regards the export of the reorganization, you would create a .exe with the changes of the organization, so you would copy that and execute it afterwards. And so the changes were made as from the latest reorganizations made. Now, if you do build, export, reorganization, you can package everything so that that reorganization is carried out. So, for instance, in the case of Java, you create a jar with everything necessary for the organization. That hasn't changed much. But now in .NET, we have a zip where everything is packaged, and you can take it up to the server and use directly there. However, you always have to take into account that this is going to start in the last reorganization. If it's the first time you're making a reorganization, then the tables and the restructures will create it on the database. But if there have been many others, changes are going to start as from the latest one. We've got to be careful with the versions and see what the changes made have been. Have you implemented message build tasks? Yes. And this is also for core, right? And there are tasks, yes. The package, in the case of net, do you get all the organization files in the build, or because you have the fonts and so on. Well, no, we are talking about the necessary to carry out the reorganization on the database, the organization of the LL and the .exe. As regards the deployment application tool, which we've got to deploy apps, if you recall, many years ago, we had the deployment wizard that allowed us to create but we didn't have a tool in deployment.net. There was an extension that allowed us to save all that on a file and take it to the server. There was no tool being able to package all that. Now, as from version 15, in fact, since the last 3 versions, we had this application available. Now, in GeneXus 16, we've got some advantages and some changes. Just for example, we'll be able to use the Lambda services of Amazon Web Services, allowing us to respond to events in our app. So the service will allow us to respond to some events in our app. And the same thing happens with API front-end services. And we needn't worry about having a server, setting up the software. This is serverless. Services are allowed. We use only the services, and we needn't make all the servers installations in the cloud. Then we generate EAR archives or ER archives. We'll see that we'll be able to deploy it in Docker containers, and that's quite good because we'll be able to create a deploy in a virtual computer, but it's going to be much lighter because you're only going to virtualize the software side. The hardware is not. So that's going to be applied. The last 2 parts are in a video, including a demo with use of Docker and deploying in Docker and seeing how it is executed. And then the deployment unit object that allows us to group deployments in a new object called a deployment unit. It used to happen that whenever you wanted to make a deployment, you wanted to make a deployment of a certain part of the app, for instance, services or web. But we didn't have a way to save all that to use it later. Now we've got the deployment unit object, which is an object that allows us to drag main objects or whatever objects we want to be included in that particular deployment, and we'll be able to deploy just that. So we'll be able to group in different deployment units the various parts of the app so that we can use them afterwards. AWG Lambda gives us the possibility. I mean, our app, when it's on the server, must respond to certain requirements from clients. For instance, a client wants to update a value or wants to request a data, or a sensor is sending information to the server and wants that data to be saved. I mean, there are many events produced in our app at server level that the application must respond to. So far, we had to worry about responding to those events and managing the server. That is, if the number of concurrent access from several clients on the same day, we had to provide an adequate scaling of the server. And we would also have to look into what we put on the server, if there were pages or deployments or whatever. Now, because of the Lambda services, we've got the possibility of writing out a certain code, and Lambda will be in charge of whenever there is an event it would execute the code that we've put in to respond to those events without having to worry to monitor the service or making the scaling. So the same Lambda service executes the code we can put in. So this could be mobile, IoT, or web apps. It could even be the case of some events true to a server, something that has to be executed. I mean, all those events are responded by the Amazon Lambda according to the requirements you may have and executing our code. Another important thing is that, in fact, we're only going to be charged, instead of charging us for the server, because when you install a server platform service and you put all the apps and we charge a fixed amount to have all that available. In this case, the server will be provided by Amazon Web Server. We are consuming services and will only be charged every time we use the service. So whenever there is an event, and that event is responded by a code that the Lambda responds, we are only charged for the time that we use it. So that serverless function is far more economical. We needn't worry about maintenance of software and upgrades necessary if the software management was in our hands. Whenever we use, yes, have you thought about having something for the Azure world, like web shops running the same way? Yes, I think so. It's not available yet, but it's within the lines in all our platforms with servers in the cloud. We try to provide similar services to these, provided the provider has them, of course. So when you use Lambda services and you want to access to a web service, you need a REST interface so that the web app can interact with those Lambda services. To that end, there is the app web, so that the app can have an entry app with some REST, so that you can have access to the services. Likewise, you only pay whenever the web app has access through the API gateway to the Lambda services, and all this falls within the serverless. Lambda can also have access to its own services by Amazon, like Dynamo, DB, or other external APIs. And all that is at the gateway, which is a REST interface given by API gateways. Now, how do we use all this from GeneXus? Well, through a build, deploy application, and what we said here, Amazon Web Serverless deploy, and we configure here the key IDs that we may have to have access to that Lambda service that we may have hired. And then when you click on deploy, you will deploy the Amazon Web Server Lambda. In the case of web apps, we have this API. Now, if in our Java app, I was saying that when we have in our Java version, we have a Java bin. We used to have a wizard to generate the archive. Remember that a special wizard would open when we're doing Java. Right now, this is integrated in the application deployment tool. So we simply drag a Java bin to the window of Java application tool, and you generate a file, enterprise Java bin. So that file will have the web application, all the server, all the hard, so that you can see it working. So the Java bins file can work. It wasn't available, now it is within GeneXus 16. One further change, when we press F6, what we are doing is making a deployment to the service we've hired in one of the cloud providers. Previously, GeneXus has helped them to set up the necessary environment so that we can make a deployment to the cloud. Or you may do it yourselves. Wiki has all the information to do so. But in fact, it's easier and it's not expensive at all to require GeneXus services to help you out in preparing all the environment ready for deployment. So when we click on F6, the first thing you'll be asked is the ID of the GeneXus accounts to have the necessary permits to make the deployments to the cloud, to any of the platforms. And then in this dialog box, you're going to choose the target, the environment, and what is the service on the cloud that is ready. And here you'll get the names of the service or the package configurations that have already been set up by GeneXus for you. Or if there are none, and there is none, then you'll make a deployment of sandbox to test. So just that with F6. So F5 would allow us to make several executions as we've done so far, but when you click on F6, it would be putting in production and an automatic upload of the servers of some of the cloud platforms. Now, the difference with version 16 is that so far, those services that were on the cloud were IaaS, infrastructure as a service, but now it could be a platform as a service. So this is in version 16. Now, what you can see here is something that is very, very interesting, and that is to make a deployment of a Docker container. There is a product called Docker, and these are containers that allowed for a deployment in a virtual computer, but much lighter one. Instead of continuing with this, we've got a video with this, and talking about deployment unit. And we've got a demo, which is quite good. So thank you.